The Grand Solstice Ball was the jewel of the vampiric social calendar. An event Lucian had orchestrated for 5 centuries with the same meticulous, predatory grace he applied to all things. The ballroom of Castle Volkov was a symphony of shadows and candlelight, where ancient beings draped in silks and velvets moved with a silence that belied their power. Laughter, when it occurred, was a low, conspiratorial murmur, and the music of the string quartet was a mournful waltz that spoke of eternity and sorrow. It was, in short, the perfect hunting ground. His target was not prey, however. Not in the traditional sense. She was a mortal woman, Sophie, a guest attached to a visiting human delegation meant to smooth over some tedious trade dispute about blood orange imports. Lucian cared little for the oranges, but he had watched her for the better part of an hour, and she was different. While her peers looked upon his court with a mixture of terror and awe, she looked bored. She had been systematically critiquing the structural integrity of the flying buttresses to her companion, a man who looked desperate to be anywhere else. She'd referred to a particularly fearsome Duke of the Northern Wastes as the one with the ridiculous hair. Lucian found it inexplicably compelling. He was king. He was Lucian, the Nightrender, the scourge of Ottomans, the last scion of the Strigoi line. Mortals were supposed to tremble. They were supposed to be overwhelmed by the sheer weight of his presence, the ancient power that clung to him like a shroud. Sophie, however, seemed utterly immune. She was currently trying to discreetly peel the label off her champagne bottle. This required a special approach. The full, undiluted application of his charm. He moved through the crowd. A river parting around a stone. The whispers and averted gazes of his subjects trailing in his wake. He arrived at her side just as she successfully removed a sliver of paper with a triumphant, albeit tiny, aha. He leaned in, positioning himself perfectly to allow the candlelight to carve his features into something timeless and predatory. He summoned the voice. It was a weapon he had honed over decades, a vocal alchemy that transformed his normal, commanding baritone into something else entirely. It was a low, gravelly purr, a sound designed to vibrate through a mortal's bones and awaken a primal, irresistible desire. It was the sound of midnight promises and eternal damnation, wrapped in velvet. "You captivate me," he rasped, the words thick with centuries of practiced allure. Sophie stopped fiddling with the bottle and turned to him. Her eyes, a startlingly clear shade of blue, widened slightly. But it wasn't with desire. It wasn't with fear. It was with clinical concern. She leaned closer, her brow furrowed. "Oh, wow, do you need a lozenge?" she asked, her voice a genuine note of worry in the Gothic symphony of the ballroom. "You sound really congested." Lucian froze. The world, which had for 500 years bent to his will, tilted on its axis. He could feel the eyes of his court upon them, though none would dare to be obvious. He had just delivered a line that had made queens swoon and empires tremble. And this mortal woman was offering him cough medicine. He blinked. A slow, reptilian motion. Perhaps she had misheard. Perhaps the music had muffled the carefully calibrated frequencies of his seduction. He would clarify. "This," he said, doubling down on the gravel, making it even deeper, huskier, a sound like tombstones grinding together, "is my seductive voice." Sophie's expression of concern only deepened. She put a hand on his arm, her touch shockingly warm against the chill of his skin. It was meant to be a gesture of submission, of being drawn into his orbit. Instead, it felt distinctly diagnostic. "Babe, that's laryngitis," she said with unshakable conviction. "Seriously, my roommate in college was a theater major who got it all the time from projecting. Do vampires get strep throat? Because that sounds painful. You should be gargling with salt water, not trying to talk to people at a party." The silence in Lucian's mind was a roaring abyss. Babe? Had she just called him Babe? He who was addressed as Your Majesty, Lord of Shadows, or, on one memorable occasion by a terrified poet, O Prince of Eternal Night and Sorrowful Longing. No one had ever called him Babe. And no one, in the entire history of his existence, had ever suggested he gargle with salt water. His entire methodology of mortal interaction was built on a foundation of 2 things: overwhelming fear and irresistible allure. The allure component was heavily, if not entirely, dependent on the voice. It was his opening gambit, his closing argument, his entire romantic playbook, and she thought he was sick. "It is not laryngitis," he managed to force out, the words feeling utterly alien without their usual velvet coating. He tried to inject a hint of dark amusement, a touch of the predator toying with its food. She wasn't buying it. "Listen, I'm not a doctor, but I've watched a lot of medical dramas. It's got that telltale rasp. It's a classic presentation. Alluring would be using your normal voice and not sounding like you're trying to start a malfunctioning motorcycle with your vocal cords." She patted his arm again, a gesture of pure, unadulterated pity. "You get some rest. And maybe some tea with honey." "Does honey work for you, no?" She gestured vaguely at his entire vampiric being. He had no response. For the first time in centuries, Lucian, king of the Carpathian vampires, was utterly, comprehensively speechless. The gears of his ancient mind, accustomed to plotting wars and navigating millennia of political intrigue, had ground to a halt against the immovable object of this woman's practical, medical concern. He simply stood there, a statue of baffled indignation, as she gave him one last sympathetic smile and turned back to her companion, gesturing toward him and whispering something that looked suspiciously like, "Poor guy's really pushing through it." His confidence, a monolith carved from 500 years of unbroken successes, didn't just crack. It collapsed, it imploded, turning into a fine dust of humiliation that settled over his immortal soul. From across the room, he saw Valerius, his oldest advisor, a vampire of terrifying austerity and even more terrifying perception. Valerius's eyebrow was raised a fraction of an inch, a tectonic shift by his standards. He had heard. Of course, he had heard. They all had. Lucian the Nightrender, devourer of empires, had just been diagnosed with a sore throat. And the worst part, the truly, existentially horrifying part, was that he was starting to wonder if his throat did feel a little scratchy. The walk back to his private chambers was the longest of Lucian's eternal life. The whispers of his court followed him like the rustling of dead leaves, a sound he was usually oblivious to but which now felt like 1,000 tiny needles pricking at his pride. He didn't need his preternatural hearing to know what they were saying. The king's voice, his legendary instrument of seduction, had been mistaken for a common ailment. He swept into his sanctum, the heavy oak doors closing behind him with a boom that failed to match the hollow thunder in his chest. The room was his refuge. A library of ancient texts and priceless artifacts, the air thick with the scent of old paper and dust. It was a place of power and solitude. Tonight, it felt like a hospital waiting room. He stood before a towering, silver-framed mirror, a vanity for a creature who cast no reflection. It was habit. He knew what he looked like. Pale, aristocratic, with eyes the color of a stormy sea and hair as black as a starless night. He was the epitome of Gothic romance, the subject of 1,000 fearful legends. An immortal woman thought he sounded like a sick muppet. He tried the voice again, alone in the silence of his chamber. "I hunger for you," he rasped to the empty air. He winced. She was right. It did sound a little strained. It sounded like he'd been shouting into a strong wind. Had it always sounded like this? Had centuries of queens and countesses just been polite? Had they swooned not from desire, but from a desperate attempt to avoid having to listen to him speak any further? The thought was so horrifying it almost made him laugh. Almost. A discreet knock echoed from the door. "Enter," Lucian called out, his voice returning to its normal resonant baritone. The command carried the effortless authority of a king. It was clear. It was powerful. It was, he now realized with a fresh wave of despair, completely unseductive. It was the voice he used to sentence traitors and declare war, not to whisper promises in the dark. Valerius entered, his ancient face an unreadable mask of granite. He moved with a stiff, formal grace, his black robes making no sound on the stone floor. In his hand, he held a small, silver tray. On the tray sat a single, amber-colored object. "Your Majesty," Valerius said, his own voice a dry whisper, like papers crumbling to dust. "Lord Cassian and I were concerned. We overheard your conversation." Lucian's jaw tightened. It was not a conversation. It was a diagnostic assessment. Valerius glided forward and placed the tray on a nearby table. Lucian stared at the object. It was a lozenge. A honey-lemon-flavored lozenge, still in its crinkly plastic wrapper. Lord Cassian is of the opinion that this particular brand is most effective for throat inflammation, Valerius stated, his face utterly devoid of expression. But his eyes, ancient pits of darkness, held a flicker of something. It was a microscopic, glacial form of amusement, an emotion so rare in Valerius it was tantamount to a mortal rolling on the floor in hysterics. "I do not require a lozenge, Valerius," Lucian said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Of course not, Your Majesty," Valerius agreed smoothly. "It is merely a precaution. One would not wish for the king to be indisposed." The unspoken words hung in the air between them. One would not wish for the king to sound like a dying frog when attempting to woo a mortal who thinks buttresses are more interesting than his entire court. Lucian wanted to incinerate the lozenge with a single thought. He wanted to throw Valerius out the highest window. But he couldn't. The humiliation was too pure, too perfect. It was unassailable. He had been defeated not by a rival, not by a hunter, but by a combination of modern medicine and female practicality. "Leave it," he commanded, turning away to stare into the fire. "As you wish, Your Majesty." Valerius bowed and retreated, leaving Lucian alone with his shattered pride and a single, mocking piece of hard candy. He spent the next hour brooding. It was one of the things he did best. He brooded with an intensity and dedication that had been the envy of poets for centuries. But his focus kept drifting. The woman, Sophie. She was an anomaly, a glitch in the predictable matrix of mortal behavior. He had built an empire on understanding human fear and desire, on knowing which levers to pull and which strings to pluck. Sophie had no levers. Her strings were apparently connected to a medical textbook. He needed to understand her. This was no longer about seduction. It was about analysis. It was a puzzle. Why was she immune? What strange, modern philosophy had inoculated her against the time-tested charms of the undead? He had to know. For scientific purposes, of course. For the good of the kingdom. He couldn't have his primary diplomatic tool rendered useless because mortals had started carrying cough drops. The next day, he arranged for her to be brought to the royal library. It was a calculated move. The library was his domain, a cathedral of knowledge and power designed to awe and intimidate. Its shelves stretched up into the darkness, holding the secrets of ages. Surely, here, surrounded by the weight of his history and intellect, she would see him as something more than a patient. She walked in, not with the hushed reverence he expected, but with an appraising squint. "Wow," she said, her voice echoing slightly in the vast space. "This is incredible. The Dewey Decimal System must be an absolute nightmare in here." Lucian was standing by a massive globe of the 15th century world. He had chosen the pose carefully. It was meant to convey wisdom, power, and a hint of weary loneliness. He did not turn. "We do not use the system of Mr. Dewey," he said, his voice a low, normal timbred baritone. He was not making that mistake again. "The collection is organized chronologically by the author's date of death." She came to stand beside him, peering at the globe. "That seems morbidly inefficient. What if you have two guys who died on the same day? Then we duel." A voice drawled from the shadows. Lord Cassian emerged, lounging against a bookshelf. He was younger than Valerius by several centuries. A flash of Byronic swagger to Valerius's stoic dread. He offered Sophie a lazy, charming smile that had, unlike Lucian's voice, never failed him. "It's a great source of entertainment on slow Tuesday nights." Sophie laughed. A real, genuine laugh. It was a shockingly bright sound in the dusty silence of the library. "I like your system." Cassian's smile widened. He shot Lucian a look that was pure, unadulterated mockery. "See? This is how it's done." Lucian ignored him. He turned his full attention to Sophie. No voice, no tricks. Just the sheer force of his presence. He would engage her intellectually. He would dazzle her with his ancient mind. "You are a student of architecture, I believe?" he began, gesturing to the grand, vaulted ceiling. "This archway is a prime example of early Gothic construction, adapted by my ancestors to, is that a first edition of Dante's Inferno?" She interrupted, her eyes wide, pointing to a leather-bound tome on a display stand. "Holy crap, can I touch it?" Lucian's lecture on Gothic architecture died in his throat. "It is exceptionally rare." "No kidding," In my world, a paperback copy of this costs $20 and smells like a warehouse. This one probably smells like history. And maybe a little bit of damnation. She moved toward it with an enthusiasm that was both alarming and, he was loath to admit, rather charming. Careful? Cassian purred, stepping in front of her. Old books can be more dangerous than old vampires. I'll take my chances, Sophie said, peering around him. I bet he has all the good circles in here. Lucien watched the exchange, a strange feeling coiling in his gut. It was not jealousy. That was a mortal emotion, messy and beneath him. It was irritation, a profound kingly irritation that Cassian, with his effortless charm and lazy wit, had so easily accomplished what Lucien had so spectacularly failed to do: build a rapport. He had to reassert control. This was his library, his baffling mortal. The collection is extensive, Lucien said, his voice a little too loud. He moved to the display case, placing himself between Sophie and Cassian. It contains texts that would rewrite your understanding of history, science, and the very nature of reality. Cool. Do you have any good beach reads? Sophie asked, completely unfazed. I'm looking for something with a good plot, maybe a little romance. Not too heavy on the damnation, if possible. I'm on vacation! Cassian snorted with laughter, quickly trying to disguise it as a cough when he saw the look on Lucien's face. The cough sounded suspiciously gravelly. Deliberately so, Lucien stared at Sophie. A beach read. She was standing in the single greatest repository of forbidden knowledge in the known world, a library that men had died to get a glimpse of, and she was asking for a paperback thriller. He was beginning to suspect that this wasn't an immunity, it was a superpower. A superpower of such profound, reality-warping normalcy that his entire world simply slid off it like water off a duck's back. I do not, he said, the words clipped. That's a shame, she said, patting the glass of the display case. Well, thanks for the tour. You have a lovely, if inefficiently organized, home library. She turned to leave, then paused and looked back at him. Oh, and by the way, she added, her expression turning earnest again. Your voice sounds much better today, see? A little rest is all it takes. She gave him a cheerful thumbs up and walked out, leaving Lucien standing in the silence of his ancient library, flanked by a smirking subordinate and the ghost of his own dignity. He looked at the priceless first edition of the Inferno. For the first time, he felt a certain kinship with the souls trapped in the ninth circle. The days that followed were a masterclass in psychological torment, orchestrated by a universe that had clearly decided Lucien's 5 centuries of regal dominance were due for a comedic reckoning. Sophie remained a guest at the castle. A stipulation of the ongoing trade negotiations that Lucien now suspected were being deliberately prolonged by the human ambassador, a man who seemed to find the king's perpetual state of baffled frustration immensely entertaining. Lucien decided a new strategy was in order. The voice had failed. Intellectual intimidation had failed. Perhaps he needed to lean into the more esoteric aspects of his nature. The subtle, potent powers that mortals whispered about in fearful legends. He would demonstrate his prowess, his otherness. He would prove to her that he was not just some gothic landlord with a sore throat. His first attempt was with the power of suggestion, the hypnotic gaze that had bent the wills of ministers and generals. He found her in the castle's gallery, studying a portrait of his great-great-grandsire, Vladimis the Morose. Vladimis was depicted scowling at a skull, looking deeply unhappy with its life choices. He looks like he just found out his favorite show was cancelled, Sophie commented as Lucien approached. Lucien came to stand beside her, positioning himself so she would have to turn and meet his eyes. He focused his will, pouring a sliver of his ancient power into his gaze. It was a subtle compulsion, a gentle nudge on the mortal psyche. You find me fascinating. You are intrigued by my dark mystery. He stared at her, his sea-storm eyes intense and unwavering. Sophie turned to him, met his gaze, and then squinted. Do you have something in your eye? She asked, leaning closer. It looks a little red. Are your contacts bothering you? I have some saline solution in my bag if you need it. The compulsion shattered against a wall of well-meaning optometric concern. He had just attempted to ensnare her soul, and she had offered him eye drops. My eyes are fine, he said through gritted teeth. Are you sure? Because you're not really blinking. That can't be good for your corneas, she pressed, ever the helpful one. You could get dry eye. It's a real problem, especially in a drafty old castle like this. He blinked. It felt like a concession, a surrender. He had to pivot. I was merely contemplating the portrait. Oh, well. In that case, you should probably know you're staring at my ear, she said, pointing. The painting's over here. Lucien retreated, his dignity in tatters once more. Hypnosis was out. His next attempt involved his preternatural speed. He would demonstrate his inhuman grace and swiftness. An opportunity arose when Sophie, exploring the east wing, dropped her guidebook down a long, winding staircase. The book tumbled end over end, destined to be battered on the stone floor far below. This was his moment. In the space between one mortal heartbeat and the next, Lucien moved. He became a blur of black silk and shadow, flowing down the stairs faster than a thought. He caught the book an inch from the ground, his movements utterly silent, impossibly swift. He reappeared at the top of the stairs, holding the book out to her without so much as a single hair out of place. It was a display of casual, terrifying power. Sophie stared at him, her mouth agape. Her face was pale. At last, he thought. Awe. Fear. A proper reaction. Then she promptly bent over and threw up in a nearby decorative urn. Lucien stood, frozen, holding the guidebook. His grand display of vampiric celerity had given her motion sickness. "Oh, God!" she gasped, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. "I'm so sorry. It's the spiral staircase. And the blur. I can't even go on the teacup ride at Disneyland. That was whoa." She looked at him, her eyes watering slightly. "Thanks for getting the book, though. That was fast." He had rendered a mortal woman physically ill with his supernatural grace. Cassian, who seemed to have developed an uncanny sixth sense for Lucien's moments of failure, appeared at the end of the hall. He took in the scene: Lucien holding the book, Sophie leaning weakly against the wall, the defiled Ming Dynasty urn, and his shoulders began to shake, with silent, suppressed laughter. Lucien decided that physical prowess was also off the table. That left the mind. The subtle art of telepathy. It was an invasive, intimate power he rarely used. But desperate times called for desperate measures. He wouldn't read her deeply, just skim the surface. He needed to understand what was happening inside that bewildering, infuriatingly practical mind. He found her in the conservatory, a vast glass dome, filled with plants that thrived in eternal twilight. Ghost orchids, nightshade, and roses, the color of dried blood. She was humming to herself and trying to teach a raven to say, "Nevermore." The raven was stubbornly saying, "corn chip," instead. Lucien focused, extending his consciousness like a careful probe. He brushed against the surface of her thoughts, expecting he wasn't sure what. Perhaps a litany of anxieties, a stream of observations, the usual chaotic noise of a human mind. What he found was a song. Baby shark, doo-doo-doo, doo-doo-doo. The ridiculously cheerful, mind-numbingly repetitive children's song was looping in her head with the force of a tidal wave. It was so loud, so insistent, that it completely drowned out everything else. Mommy shark, doo-doo-doo-doo-doo-doo. Lucien physically recoiled, stumbling back a step. He felt as though his brain had been scrubbed with a steel brush and bubblegum-scented cleaner. The sheer, weaponized inanity of it was more potent than any psychic shield he had ever encountered. Sophie looked up, her humming ceasing. "You okay there, Sparkles? You look like you just saw a ghost." He couldn't speak. The song was still echoing in the hollows of his skull. He, Lucien the Nightrender, whose mind was a fortress of dark secrets and ancient strategies, had been psychically assaulted by a nursery rhyme about a family of cartilaginous fish. "I am fine," he managed, the words tasting like ash and saccharine pop music. "Good, good," she said, turning back to the raven. "Okay, Edgar. Let's try again." "Nevermore. Corn chip," the raven squawked triumphantly. Sophie sighed. "We'll work on it." She glanced back at Lucien. "You know, for a scary lord of the night, you spend a lot of time looking confused. It's kind of your default setting, isn't it?" He didn't have an answer. She was right. He was confused. This woman operated on a plane of existence he couldn't comprehend. Every tool in his arsenal, every trick learned over centuries of dominance, was useless. She didn't play by the rules because she didn't seem to know the game existed. She was a walking, talking subversion of his entire reality. And the truly maddening part? He was starting to like it. Beneath the constant grinding humiliation, there was something else. Something refreshing. No one had spoken to him without a thick filter of fear or sycophantic reverence in centuries. Sophie spoke to him as if he were just a person. A slightly weird, gravelly-voiced, overly dramatic person who needed to blink more often, but a person nonetheless. She saw the king of the vampires, and her first thoughts were of his throat health, his ocular hygiene, and his susceptibility to motion sickness. She saw past the power, the legend, the terror, and went straight to the mundane. In its own way, it was a form of intimacy more profound than any seduction he'd ever attempted. She wasn't seeing the monster, she was seeing the man. The fact that she thought the man was a bit of a mess was a secondary issue. Later that evening, Cassian found him staring into the fire, a glass of ruby-red liquid untouched in his hand. "Tough day at the office, Your Majesty?" Cassian asked, lounging in a nearby armchair with his usual insouciant grace. Lucian swirled the blood in his glass. "She is an affliction." "She's magnificent," Cassian countered, grinning. "I haven't had this much fun since the French Revolution." Valerius is even starting to crack a smile. "It's terrifying. Yesterday, I caught him looking up sore throat remedies in an old alchemy text. Do not mock me, Cassian. I'm not mocking you. I'm congratulating you," Cassian said, his tone turning surprisingly serious. "For centuries, you've been surrounded by mirrors. Everyone reflecting back the image of the great, fearsome king they think you want to see. She's not a mirror, she's a window. Or maybe one of those funhouse mirrors that makes you look all weird and stretchy. Either way, it's a change of scenery." Lucian considered this. A window. He looked into the fire, but he saw her face, brow furrowed in genuine concern as she offered him a lozenge. It was the most honest human interaction he'd had in a very long time. "Her mind," Lucian said quietly, "is filled with sharks." Cassian blinked. "I'm sorry?" "Singing sharks. A whole family of them." Cassian stared at him for a long moment, then slowly shook his head. "I have no idea what that means, and I'm absolutely certain I don't want to know. But it sounds like you're finally having a real conversation." He stood up, stretching like a contented cat. "Keep at it, old friend. This is far more interesting than trade disputes." He paused at the door. "Oh, and for what it's worth? The motorcycle comparison was my favorite." Lucian was left alone with his thoughts, the fire, and the faint, phantom echo of do-do-do-do-do-do-do. He was the most powerful vampire in the world, and his primary emotional state was now a constant low-grade bewilderment. And for the first time in a long, long while, he had absolutely no idea what was going to happen next. It was an unsettling feeling. It was also, he was beginning to realize, the most alive he'd felt in a century. The turning point came, as it often does, not with a whisper, but with a bang. Or, more accurately, with the shattering of a priceless stained glass window and the unwelcome arrival of Baron Volkov, a rival claimant to Lucian's throne from a brutish northern clan. Volkov was everything Lucian was not. Loud, crude, and a firm believer that subtlety was for weaker men. He and his coterie of leather-clad thugs crashed the tedious final trade dinner with all the grace of a runaway avalanche. "Lucian!" Volkov boomed, his voice echoing through the great hall. He was a mountain of a man, with a thick beard and eyes like chips of ice. "Growing soft in your decadent castle, I see. Entertaining humans now? What's next? A book club?" Lucian rose slowly from his seat at the head of the table. His expression one of pure glacial rage. His court followed suit, the air crackling with sudden, violent tension. The human delegation froze, forks halfway to their mouths. "Volkov," Lucian said, his normal voice low and lethal, stripped of all artifice. It was the voice of a commander on the battlefield, a sound that promised swift and terrible retribution. "You have 10 seconds to remove your flea-bitten hide from my hall before I have it tanned and turned into a rug." Volkov laughed, a harsh, grating sound, always with the pretty words, "I prefer action." He gestured to his men, who drew their blades, the scrape of steel against stone, setting everyone's teeth on edge. In the ensuing chaos, Lucian's only thought was of Sophie. He scanned the room, his eyes cutting through the panic. She was near the back, by the human ambassador, her face pale, but her expression more angry than scared. She was clutching a silver butter knife like a dagger, which was both absurd and strangely endearing. As Volkov's thugs clashed with the royal guard, the Baron himself strode toward the head table, his eyes fixed on Lucien. But one of his lieutenants, a vicious-looking vampire with a scarred face, broke away, heading directly for the human delegation. For Sophie, time seemed to slow. Lucien saw the threat, the glint in the thug's eye, the way his lips curled back from his fangs. There was no time for a plan, no time for a clever word or a hypnotic trick. There was only instinct. He moved. Not with the flashy, disorienting speed he'd used on the stairs, but with a brutal, focused efficiency. He crossed the hall in a heartbeat, a silent black arrow. He intercepted the thug just as the vampire reached for Sophie, his hand closing around the man's throat like a vice. There was a sickening crunch of bone, and the thug dropped, lifeless. Lucien didn't even spare him a glance. He placed himself directly in front of Sophie, shielding her with his body. He turned to face the chaos, his eyes burning with a cold, protective fire he hadn't felt in centuries. "Get back," he ordered her, not looking away from the fight. His voice was raw, urgent. It was not seductive, it was not kingly, it was simply real. From behind him, he heard her say, "Holy hell." It was a breathy, shocked whisper. The fight was short and brutal. Volkov was strong, but Lucien was a king forged in the fires of ancient wars. Their duel was a whirlwind of motion and fury, but it ended as it always would, with Lucien standing victorious and Volkov kneeling, disarmed and bleeding, on the marble floor. The hall fell silent, the only sounds the ragged breathing of the combatants, and the whimpering of Volkov's defeated men. Lucien stood over his rival, the tip of an ancestral blade at Volkov's throat. "You were saying something about softness?" he asked, his voice a deadly calm. He dealt with the intruders swiftly, banishing Volkov and his surviving thugs to the cursed salt mines of the north, a fate worse than death. He restored order with a few clipped commands, his authority absolute and unquestioned. Through it all, he was aware of Sophie watching him. Her expression was unreadable. After the hall was cleared and the shaken human delegation was escorted to their chambers, Lucien found her standing alone by the shattered window, looking out at the moonlit snow. The cold air swirled around her, but she didn't seem to notice. He approached her quietly. The adrenaline of the fight had faded, leaving behind a strange, hollow feeling. "Are you unharmed?" he asked. His voice was quiet, still holding the rough edge of the battle. She turned to him. The witty, sarcastic armor she always wore was gone. Her blue eyes were wide and serious, searching his face. "I'm fine," she said, her voice a little shaky. You snapped his neck, like a twig." "He would have killed you," Lucien stated. It was a simple, undeniable fact. "I know." She hugged her arms around herself. "It's just 1 minute you're a weird, socially awkward landlord who sounds like he needs cough syrup, and the next you're that." She gestured vaguely at the lingering sense of violence in the room. The real deal. The scary monster from the stories. This was the moment he had, in a way, been working toward. The moment she would finally see him for what he was. A powerful, dangerous, ancient predator. He expected fear. He expected her to shrink away. He had prepared himself for it. But she didn't shrink away. She took a step closer. "You saved my life," she said softly. "I was protecting what is mine," he said, the old possessive instincts rising to the surface. It was a classic vampire line, one that should have dripped with dark romantic threat. Sophie just raised an eyebrow, a flicker of her old self returning. "What is yours? Am I a piece of furniture now? The royal human?" Lucien sighed, the tension draining out of him. Even now, she wouldn't let him get away with it. "Forgive me, old habits. I was protecting you." They stood in silence for a long moment, the moonlight from the broken window painting them in silver and shadow. The grand theatrical world he had built for himself had been shattered along with the glass, and all that was left was the two of them in the quiet aftermath. "That voice you used," she said, her gaze unwavering. "Just now, when you were fighting. And when you told me to get back. That's the one." He was confused. "The one?" "Yeah. The voice," she said. Not the gravelly laryngitis thing. Not the big booming king thing. That one. The one that's just you. When you're not trying so hard. She reached out, her fingers hesitating for a second before they rested on his arm. Her touch was gentle, questioning. That's the alluring one. His carefully constructed world, which had been collapsing in slow motion for days, finally gave way completely. All his tricks, all his powers, all his ancient practiced techniques of seduction had been worthless. The thing she found attractive, the thing that finally broke through her defenses, was the one thing he had never thought to show her, himself, the raw, unfiltered core of him that only came out when everything else was stripped away. He started, but he had no words. The king who commanded legions and debated philosophy with ghosts was once again speechless. You know, she continued, a small, wry smile touching her lips. For a guy who can move faster than I can see and snap necks with his bare hands. You're really bad at this. Bad at what? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Dating, she said simply. A laugh escaped him. It wasn't a planned, charming chuckle. It was a real, startled burst of sound. The shock of it, the sheer absurdity of the word dating being used in this context, broke through his composure. Sophie's smile widened. See? That's better too. He looked at her. Truly looked at her. Not as a puzzle to be solved, or a mortal to be impressed, but as the woman who saw through his 500 years of nonsense. The woman who thought his seductive voice was an illness, who offered him eye drops for his hypnotic gaze, whose mind was a fortress of cartoon sharks, and who had just faced down a pack of murderous vampires with a butter knife. The vulnerability he felt was more terrifying than any battle he'd ever fought. He had hidden behind the persona of the king for so long. He wasn't sure who Lucien was without it. But she saw him. And she wasn't running away. Sophie, he said, her name feeling strange and wonderful on his tongue. He used his real voice, the one she liked. I confess, I have no idea what I am doing. I know, she said, her hand still on his arm. It's kind of adorable. He had been called many things in his long life. Terrifying, magnificent, cruel, eternal. But no one, ever, had called him adorable. And as he looked down at her, at the genuine warmth in her eyes, he found that he didn't mind it at all. The jokes could stop, the sarcasm could fade, because in the quiet of the broken hall, they had finally found something sincere. In the aftermath of the Volkov incident, a strange and unprecedented peace settled over the castle. The human trade delegation, having witnessed their host casually dispatch a small army of intruders, swiftly agreed to all of Lucien's terms. The price of blood oranges was no longer a point of contention. The ambassador practically threw the treaty at Lucien, his hands still trembling slightly. But the true shift was not political. It was personal. The invisible wall of witty banter and mutual exasperation between Lucien and Sophie had become porous. The sincerity they had found in that moonlit broken hall now wove itself through their interactions, adding a new layer of warmth beneath the humor. The teasing from his court did not stop, of course. If anything, it evolved. It was no longer just about the failed seduction. It was now about the king's baffling, and very obvious, infatuation. A few days later, Lucien was in his study, reviewing packs of fealty, when Valerius entered. The ancient vampire moved with his usual solemnity. But Lucien's senses, now keenly attuned to the subtle shifts in his court, detected an almost imperceptible change in his demeanor. Your Majesty, Valerius intoned, placing a small velvet-wrapped box on the desk. Lucien eyed it with suspicion. If this is another lozenge, Valerius, I will have you personally cataloging every book in the library by color. A flicker of what might have been horror crossed Valerius's face. It is not a lozenge, my king. It is a gift. For the Lady Sophie. Lucien raised an eyebrow. He unwrapped the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of silk, was a beautifully crafted silver raven, its eyes tiny chips of obsidian. It was an exquisite piece of jewelry. It is from the royal treasury, Valerius explained. Lord Cassian and I thought, given her affinity for the birds, it might be an appropriate gesture. Lucien stared at the brooch. This was not a joke. This was a genuine, thoughtful gift, selected by his two most senior advisors. It was their way of giving him their blessing. Their way of acknowledging that the strange, sarcastic mortal woman had become important. She is not the Lady Sophie. Lucien corrected him softly, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. She is just Sophie. Of course, Your Majesty, Valerius said, dipping his head in a gesture of understanding. Just Sophie. Lucien found her later in the conservatory, where her ongoing project to re-educate the raven was meeting with its usual success. Cornchip! The raven, Edgar, squawked as Lucien approached. We're making progress, Sophie said defensively. Yesterday, all he would say was waffles. She turned to Lucien, her smile bright and easy. What's up, Your Royal Darkness? He held out the box. A gift. She opened it, her eyes widening at the sight of the silver raven. Wow, Lucien. This is beautiful, but you really don't have to. It wasn't from me, he admitted. It was from Valerius and Cassian. Sophie looked from the brooch to Lucien, a look of stunned comprehension on her face. Your grumpy grandpa and your smirky brother approve of me? They are my advisors, not my relatives, he corrected, though the descriptions were not entirely inaccurate. And yes, it would appear they do. She pinned the brooch to her sweater, the silver stark against the dark wool. Well, that's surprisingly sweet. Tell them thank you. And tell them this doesn't mean I'll stop calling Valerius Count von Count. Lucien found himself laughing again. It was becoming a distressingly frequent occurrence. He sat beside her on the stone bench, the scent of night-blooming jasmine thick in the air. For a while, they were quiet, simply enjoying the strange peace they had found. So, Sophie said, breaking the silence, now that your secret identity as a terrifying warrior king is out, what's next on the agenda? Annexing Poland? Brooding on a windswept cliff? I was considering an afternoon of quiet contemplation, he replied, playing along, followed by an evening of existential dread. Sounds like a Tuesday, she quipped. Can I make a suggestion? I am, as you have so keenly observed, open to them. Teach me to dance. Lucien blinked. Pardon? A waltz, she clarified. You guys are all about the waltz here. But I have the grace of a newborn giraffe. You owe me one, anyway. The last time I was in a ballroom with you, you gave me a medical scare. He couldn't argue with that logic. That evening, he cleared the floor of the smaller, more intimate music room. He lit a few candles, dismissed the musicians, and let the silence of the castle be their accompaniment. He took her hand, his cool fingers lacing with her warm ones. He placed a hand on her waist. The formal posture of the dance felt both ridiculously archaic and incredibly intimate. Ready? He asked, his voice low. Just try not to move at the speed of light. My stomach is still recovering, she warned. He led her through the basic steps, his movements fluid and patient. As she had predicted, she was clumsy at first, stepping on his feet more than once. But she was a quick study, and her laughter filled the room every time she stumbled. You know, she said, leaning her head against his shoulder as they began to move more smoothly. This is much better than the gravel voice technique. I am beginning to see the error of my ways, he admitted, pulling her a little closer. The formal distance of the dance was shrinking, becoming something else entirely. Don't get me wrong, she continued, her voice soft against his chest. The voice is memorable. I'll be telling my therapist about it for years. And then the vampire king, who sounded like Tom Waits with a head cold, tried to hit on me. Please don't. But this, she murmured, is nice. They danced in silence for a long time, their steps falling into a comfortable, easy rhythm. The grand, theatrical seduction had failed. But this simple, quiet moment was more potent than any spell he could have woven. It wasn't about power, or mystery, or ancient allure. It was just two people, one ancient and one very modern, finding their footing together. Finally he stopped, though he didn't let her go. He looked down at her, the candlelight flickering in her eyes. All the jokes, all the sarcasm, had melted away, leaving only the quiet sincerity they had discovered. Sophie, he said, his voice the one she liked, the one that was just his. Lucien, she replied, her smile soft. He leaned in and kissed her. It was not the kiss of a predator claiming his prize, or a king bestowing a favor. It was hesitant, gentle, and deeply real. It was a question and an answer all at once. When they broke apart, Sophie was beaming. "Okay," she said. "That was definitely better than a lozenge." A few weeks later, as the trade delegation prepared for their departure, Sophie sought him out in the library. She found him not posed by a globe, but sitting in a comfortable chair, actually reading a book. "So, this is it," she said, leaning against the doorframe. Lucien looked up, closing the book. His heart, a thing that had not beaten in 500 years, felt a strange phantom ache. "You are leaving." "My flight is tomorrow," she confirmed. "Gotta get back to my world of student loans and overpriced coffee." She walked over to him, her silver raven brooch glinting. "It's been weird." "A fitting summation," he agreed. "I'm going to miss you, you know," she said, her usual witty tone softening into something vulnerable. "I'm going to miss this ridiculous, drafty castle. I'm even going to miss Edgar and his obsession with processed corn snacks. And you." The admission costing him more than he would ever let on. The thought of his castle without her in it, without her bright, jarring, wonderful presence, was a bleak one. The silence would return, but it would no longer feel peaceful. It would feel empty. She bit her lip, looking down at the floor. "So, here's a thought. A crazy, probably stupid thought. What if I didn't go?" He stood up, his gaze intense. "What are you suggesting?" "I don't know," she said, throwing her hands up in a gesture of exasperated surrender. "I stay. We figure it out. We could try that dating thing. I could help you organize this library. We could get Edgar to say something other than corn chip. The possibilities are endless." He stepped toward her, taking her hands in his. "You would stay? Here? In this world of shadows and inefficient filing systems?" "Well, yeah," she said. As if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Someone has to be here to make sure you're not gargling gravel before you talk to people. It's a full-time job." The relief that washed over him was so profound it almost brought him to his knees. He, who had commanded armies and ruled for an eternity, was being saved from an eternity of loneliness by a woman who thought he had a chronic throat condition. "I believe," he said, a genuine wide smile spreading across his face, "that I would like that very much." That evening, as they stood on the balcony overlooking the moon-drenched mountains, Lucien felt a mischievous impulse. He leaned in close to her ear, and with perfect, deliberate execution, he summoned the voice, the deep, gravelly, over-the-top rasp that had started it all. "You captivate me, Sophie," he purred, putting every ounce of ridiculous, theatrical seduction he could muster into it. She listened, a serious expression on her face. She put a hand to his forehead, as if checking for a fever. Then she broke into a peal of laughter so loud and clear it echoed across the silent valley. He laughed with her, the sound of their shared joy, a new kind of music in the ancient castle. The king had finally found his queen, and their reign, he knew, would be one filled with endless banter, mutual exasperation, and a whole lot of laughter. And maybe, just maybe, a lifetime supply of throat lozenges. He wouldn't have it any other way.